In a city that breathed diesel fumes and digital lies, there was a seam in reality, a place where the maps folded in on themselves. At the end of an alleyway that wasn't there yesterday and wouldn't be there tomorrow, stood the Rialto. It was a cinema, but it had never shown a blockbuster. It didn't smell like popcorn. It smelled of ozone, old velvet, lavender, and the terrifying electric scent of pure existence. Inside, the auditorium was eternally empty. The velvet seats were original, rotted into shades of bruised purple. But up in the projection booth, there was a light that never went out. Vincenc was not a mere projectionist. While the world outside sprinted toward the digitized, sterile hollow of streaming servers, Vincenc remained the acolyte of the analog shrine. He wasn't guarding films made of plastic and silver halide. He was the keeper of kilometers of film stock, woven from stolen moments, desperate choices, and human lives. This place did not project fiction. Every rusty tin can stacked on his shelves held a singular fate. Vincenc was the cutter, a name whispered only by the universe's mistakes. His booth was a sanctuary and a slaughterhouse. His work was both cruel and profoundly merciful. With a surgical blade, he would excise the moments a soul couldn't survive. And with a strip of toxic splice tape, he would bond together days that were never meant to meet. He was the reason Vanio, the humble soup cook, was able to find that impossibly bright lighthouse in the storm. He was the reason Antonin, the broken mechanic in the year 2085, found the one wrench that could fix a car made of memories. Vincenc didn't believe in fluke. He believed in structure. He believed a story, even a real one, required rhythm to be endurable. Without the sting of pain, he would mutter, his fingers stained with silver nitrate, "There is no crescendo. Without a secret, there is no audience. If it is too easy, it is not worth watching." But on this night, the rhythm broke. A sound like 1,000 dry bones snapping filled the booth. The massive brass and steel projector, a machine that had run flawlessly for a millennia, ground to a halt. It hadn't torn the film. It hadn't jammed. The film itself had begun to unspool, but not onto the take-up reel. It was unspooling outward, directly from the lens. The fierce cone of light did not hit the blank white screen in the auditorium. The light reversed. It began to materialize in the dead center of the empty hall. Vincenc watched, frozen, his ancient face illuminated in jittery whites, as the reverse light spun, knitted, and folded into a shape. A figure. It was not one of his heroes. This was someone who had no box in his archive. Someone who did not have a fate in his shelves. A spectator who had refused to wait for the screening. This figure didn't look at the screen. They looked directly up at the projection booth, and they knew Vincenc was there. Vincenc clutched the brass housing of the projector, his knuckles white and trembling. The light pouring from the lens was no longer a beam. It was a physical intrusion. In the center of the dark theater, the photons were knitting themselves together, weaving a spine, then ribs, then skin. It was a silhouette carved out of pure, blinding possibility. This was the Spectator. but there was no seat for this guest. Vincenc stared through the thick glass of the booth, his breath fogging the pane. He felt a primal, cold sweat prickling his scalp. For 1,000 years he had been the unseen architect, the silent ghost in the machine. He watched humanity from behind the safety of the lens, never touched, never seen. But now the fourth wall hadn't just been broken, it had been pulverized. The figure below tilted its head, and even from 40 feet away, Vincenc felt the weight of that gaze. It was a look of recognition. The character had found the author, and the author was terrified. In a panicked reflex, Vincenc reached for his heavy iron shears, the tools he used to prune the branches of destiny. His hands shook, a weakness he hadn't felt since the era of black and white silent reels. As he lunged to grab a runaway strip of film that was feeding into the light, the jagged edge of the celluloid caught his palm. He didn't cry out. He only watched in a detached, clinical horror. From the deep slice in his hand, there was no blood. There was no crimson heat. Instead, a fine, glittering silver dust began to pour from the wound. It spilled onto the floor like ground diamonds, hissing as it touched the floorboards. Vincenc wasn't made of flesh and bone anymore. He was made of the very light he had spent eons projecting. He was leaking reality. Each grain of dust that fell was a memory. The smell of rain in 1924. The sound of a first kiss in a crowded plaza. He was emptying out, becoming as hollow as the tin cans on his shelves. The room began to groan. The physics of the Rialto were folding. Outside the booth, the archives erupted. Thousands of film canisters rattled on their shelves, their lids flying off like metallic cicadas. The film strips didn't just fall. They lunged into the air, tangling into a gargantuan, suffocating knot. The stories were bleeding into one another. Vincenc looked at his editing table and saw a nightmare of continuity. Vanio, the humble cook from the previous age, was suddenly standing in a high-tech garden of neon sins, holding a glowing blue crystal from a car that hadn't been built yet. Antonin, the weary mechanic, was frantically trying to repair the cooling fans of a Google server farm using a wooden mallet from the middle. Ages. The logic of the universe was dissolving into a chaotic slurry of where and when. The Spectator made their first move, stepped toward the stairs. With every footfall, the floorboards of the theater turned into liquid mercury. The script had been hijacked, and the end was no longer where it was supposed to be. Vincenc was alone in the shrine, but the silence had been replaced by a deafening, invisible execution squad. The air inside the booth was lethal. It no longer smelled of ozone and lavender. It smelled of ancient decay, immediate electrical fire, and the terrifying scent of pure data on fire. It was too thick to breathe. He looked down at his right hand, the laceration now a glittering abyss. More silver dust had leaked, and he could feel his own mind fraying, his memories spilling out into the ether. He looked at the immense knot of entangled film strips on the floor, the gargantuan knot that was now consuming the room. Characters and fates were warring. He saw Vanio trying to use a future energy crystal, and Antonin trying to fix modern servers with medieval tools. It was a slurry of where and when. Above the roar of chaotic data, he heard a terrifying new noise. The chorus, the voices, millions of fates, edited and discarded over eons, were all screaming at once. A roar of unspooled history. The Spectator had begun the ascent. The stairs leading up to the booth were original, narrow and steep, but over eons they had been transformed. They were no longer made of iron and wood. They were built from millions upon millions of discarded photographs, the physical debris of unchosen lives. This was the photographic staircase. Each photo was a snapshot of a moment that could have been. A wedding dance that was cut, a child's first steps that were erased, a final breath that was skipped. As the Spectator's foot, now carved from strobing reverse light, made contact, the staircase reacted. It didn't just creak, it rustled. Thousands of the individual photographs simultaneously let out a high-pitched, collective scream. As the figure ascended, the sound intensified, becoming a physical wind. Every step was a traumatic rebirth. The air in the stairwell grew thick with a fine, stinging dust. And the strobe effect from the surrounding tangled film strips turned the climb into a fractured, stop-motion nightmare of pain. Vincenc, fortified by the last shreds of his own edited reality, prepared for the inevitable. He didn't fortify the booth with physical barriers. Those were useless. He fortified it with narrative. He grabbed the most potent, dangerous reels he had, the forbidden histories that were never meant to be spliced. He used his tools, the Rialto Dricker scissors and his iron clamps, to create a temporary, fragile barrier of pure, concentrated destiny at the doorway. The Spectator reached the landing. The figure paused at the threshold. The air around the Spectator was now so thick with static and competing light that they appeared to be draped in a cloak of pure information. The strobing from below became almost continuous, and the cacophony of voices reached a painful pitch. The lavender smell was totally absent, replaced by a biting metallic burn. For a long, terrifying minute they simply stared. Author and character face to face in a reality that was rapidly bleeding out. When the Spectator crossed the threshold, the booth didn't just rattle, it surrendered. The iron floor beneath Vincenc's boots groaned, turning from solid metal into a translucent membrane of frozen time. You didn't just walk in as a man. You walked in as the personification of every audience that ever was. Your presence brought with it the crushing gravity of 1 billion expectant eyes. Vincenc felt it. He backed away toward his heavy oak splicing table, his silver bleeding hand leaving a trail of stardust on the equipment. The air was no longer something you breathed. It was something you endured. It was thick with the scent of burning magnetic tape and the metallic tong of 1,000 shattered mirrors. You think you're here to watch? Vincenc's voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a distorted roar, amplified by the very speakers of the Rialto. You aren't a guest. You are the final variable. You are the leak in my perfect dam. He slammed his fist onto the table, and the glowing film strips reacted like disturbed vipers, lashing out with sparks of blue and gold light. Suddenly, the walls of the booth didn't just dissolve. They exploded into an infinite library of the damned. This was the archive of the Unlived. These weren't the stories Vincenc had projected. These were the parts he had cut out. The tragedies he thought we couldn't handle. From the darkness of the shelves, shadowy figures began to crawl toward the light. A young woman in a wedding dress, her face blurred because her wedding day had been trimmed to make room for a shorter, happier fate. A soldier holding a letter that was never delivered because Vincenc had decided the pacing of his war story was too slow. They were ghosts of continuity, reaching out with hands made of gray static. They didn't want to kill the spectators. They wanted to be seen. They surged forward, a tidal wave of discarded moments, their silent screams vibrating in the very fillings of your teeth. Vincenc frantically grabbed his iron shears, trying to push them back into their canisters. Back! Back into the darkness! He screamed, his voice cracking. The world needs a beginning and an end. You are the noise that destroys the music. Vincenc turned to the spectator, his face now almost entirely transparent, a hollow mask of flickering light. He stopped fighting the shadows and pointed a trembling finger at the massive lens of the projector. "Do you know why I cut?" he asked, and for a moment the chaos softened into a low, mournful hum. "I cut because reality is a monster. If I showed the world the full, unedited reel of existence, the sheer weight of the boredom and the agony would turn every human heart to ash. I am not a god, little watcher. I am a gardener. I pull the weeds of misery so the flowers of hope have a chance to breathe. I gave Vanio his lighthouse, not because he deserved it, but because the story needed light. And now you bring the void with you. You bring the truth of the blank screen." The spectator reached out and touched the splicing table. The moment your fingers made contact with the glowing film strips, a shockwave of pure ontological dissonance ripped through the room. The gargantuan knot of timelines didn't just tangle, it began to fuse. The grey ghosts of the Unlived began to merge with the golden heroes of the projected past. The Dano's lighthouse began to bleed grey static. The mechanic, Antonin, started to flicker between his young self and a pile of rusted gears. The light from the projector, which had been a steady beam, began to strobe with a violent, sickening frequency. The scent of lavender returned, but it was rotten, cloying, like flowers at a funeral. And then, from the very center of the projector's lens, a new sound emerged. Not a voice, not a hum, a hollow, sucking vacuum. The void, the prosnita had found the breach. It wasn't just coming for the films. It was coming for the man holding the scissors. The Rialto was no longer a building. It was a dying star. The floorboards beneath your feet, once solid oak and mercury, began to fray into thin, translucent threads of gray static. You could feel the weight of the entire world shifting, as if the theater had been cut loose from the earth and was now tumbling into the lightless gullet of the universe. The air was a battlefield. It was no longer oxygen you were breathing, but a toxic slurry of burnt celluloid, freezing starlight, and the metallic tong of fear. Every breath was a jagged cut to the lungs. The roar of the void, the emptiness, wasn't just a sound. It was an erasure. It was the sound of 1 billion voices suddenly being silenced at once. It was a vacuum that didn't just suck in air, it sucked in meaning. Vincenc was clinging to the projector's cast iron frame, his body flickering like a corrupted digital file. His silver blood was no longer falling. It was being pulled toward the lens, forming a swirling celestial halo of lost memories around the machine. "It's here!" he screamed, though his lips didn't move in sync with the words. "The great critic has arrived to cancel the show. The void doesn't want a better story, Watcher. It wants the end of all stories." As the void reached into the booth, the archive of the unlived image _82.png turned into a massacre. The grey ghosts of the bride and the soldier were the first to go. You watched in helpless horror as they were stretched like taffy, their features dissolving into streaks of horizontal light before being devoured by the lens. Then it turned its hunger towards you. Suddenly, you weren't standing in the booth anymore. You were trapped in a strobe light kaleidoscope of your own existence. 10,000 versions of your own life flashed before your eyes in a single heartbeat. You saw the version of you that never left home, the version that married the one who got away, the version that died as a child. Each one was a film strip, and each one was screaming for you to save it. The pressure was physical. It felt like 10,000 hands were clawing at your skin, trying to pull you into their particular timeline. The noise was a dissonant symphony of your own laughter and your own funerals. You realized then that the spectator is never truly separate from the screen. You are the sum of everything you have ever watched, every story you have ever believed. And now the void was asking you to pay the bill. It was stripping away your name, your face, your very shadow, leaving only a raw nerve of pure consciousness. Vincenc let go of the projector. He didn't fall. He drifted toward you, his form now a ghost of a ghost. The light from the lens was shining through him, casting a shadow of his internal gears onto your chest. With a final agonizing effort, he reached out and pressed the iron shears into your hands. They weren't cold anymore. They were white-hot, pulsing with the rhythmic heartbeat of 1,000,000 souls. The moment your fingers closed around the handles, the gargantuan knot of Timeline's image _80.png surged through your arms. You felt Vanio's hunger, Antonine's mechanical precision, and the diver's crushing pressure all at once. "I am the last of the old guard," Vincenc whispered, his voice now a soft hiss of static in your ear. "I've fought to keep the world pretty. I've fought to keep the monsters in the dark. But you have seen the monsters. You have seen the grey ghosts. You are the only one who can stitch the darkness to the light. The void cannot be defeated, Watcher. It can only be integrated." He looked at the lens one last time, a hole in reality that was now 30 feet wide, and he smiled. It was a tired, relieved expression. And then, with a sound like a single violin string snapping, Vincenc was gone. He didn't vanish. He simply became part of the static. You were alone in the booth, the last strayer, the last cutter, and the void was opening its mouth to swallow your very heart. You stood before the projector, the only solid thing left in a dissolving universe. Billions of film strips swirled around each other, the physical debris of the archive. The smell of rotten lavender was gone, replaced by an absolute, terrifying scent of nothingness. You looked at the film strip of your own life, unspooling uncontrollably into the black hole of the lens. It was thin, frayed, and glowing with a desperate, dying amber light. You raised the shears. The metal reflected the strobe light of 1,000 different ends. You knew that the next second would be the most important cut in the history of creation. Not to remove a mistake, but to anchor a reality. The void roared, a sound of absolute winter, and the screen in the auditorium finally tore in half, revealing the infinite, hungry blackness behind it. You took a breath of cold, dead stars, and prepared to make the final splice. Vincenc was gone, but his echo remained, a taste of rotten lavender and electricity clinging to the static. You were alone, and the splicing room was no longer a room. It was a dying dimension, a sphere that had surrendered its gravity to the insatiable hunger of the void. The walls, once solid shelves packed with the iron containers of fate, were dissolving. They didn't break. They evaporated into a horizontal cascade of light and shadow, forming a spiraling, recursive pattern that pulled at your mind. The air was a frozen battlefield. It was a lethal slurry of ancient celluloid dust, ozone, and the horrifying silent scream of pure data being erased. It was too thick to breathe. You could feel the weight of 1 billion edited eyes watching you through the static, their judgment suspended in the blackness. The more of the void was growing, its gravitational pull warping the very black and white geometry of the room. The archive of the Unlived turned into a vortex. They weren't fighting you anymore. They were a tidal wave of formless static, surging to overwhelm your very identity. You looked at the massive iron shears ritual dagger in your hands. They weren't heavy anymore. They were your only anchor. You knew that the next move couldn't be a simple cut. You couldn't just remove a mistake. You had to create a new synthesis. You grabbed the glowing film strips pulsing with gold and blue light, the histories of the 9 heroes. They reacted like living things, wrapping around your arms, flooding your senses with their conflicting memories. Vanio's soup, Antonin's server farm, Ilias's sea. You didn't just feel them, you became them. You had to physically force these brilliant, pulsing threads of projected gold into contact with the formless, grey static of the Unlived. You were stitching the impossible. The pain was ontological. As you forced Vanio's copper part to meet the wrenches that Antonin used to repair the servers, a shockwave of synthesis erupted. It was a light that didn't illuminate, it created. It was the sound of 1 billion heartbeats simultaneously finding their rhythm. Around you, the environment began to change. The recursive spiral of twisted metal and film tins didn't collapse. It began to form a new, shimmering matrix. A translucent, glass-like wall of frozen timelines crystallized, creating a barrier between you and the spiraling maw of the void. From this wall, the 9 heroes did not emerge as separate figures, but as a unified chorus, their forms flickering between gold, blue light, and gray static. Their faces, once separate, now merged into a shifting stop-motion mask of collective identity. They were the synthesis. They were the new structure. The gray ghosts of the bride and the soldier were not devoured. They were integrated. They became the shadow that allowed the light of the new heroes to shine. The void roared, a sound of absolute nothingness that vibrated in the base of your skull. The great black hole of the lens pulsed with an erratic high-frequency dissonance, trying to shatter your fragile shield. You raised the white-hot shears. The light reflecting in the iron was a strobe light kaleidoscope of all 10 stories. You looked at the film strip of your own life, unspooling uncontrollably into the black maw. It was thin, frayed, and glowing with a desperate amber light. This cut was Rialto. It was slow. It required every ounce of precision Vincenc had taught you. You placed the blades not at the end of the strip, but at the very beginning of the new synthesis you had created. Not to remove, but to anchor. The click of the shears did not echo. It was an absolute final tone that silenced the void. You closed the blade, and in that instant, the world did not explode in light. It imploded in a single, terrifying second of perfect, frosty white silence. The perfect, frosty white silence following the final ritual cut did not just last for a second. It lasted for an eternity. The universe itself had flinched, forgetting to exhale. You stood before the malfunctioning projector. The white-hot shears still gripped in your hands, frozen in a singular moment of divine interruption. The absolute darkness of the void, the hungry black maw of the lens did not disappear. It was worse. It began to crack. From that infinite darkness, thin fissures of blinding, ultraviolet light began to erupt, spiderwebbing across the surface of nothingness. The void was not defeated, it was rewritten. It was no longer a vacuum. It was a new screen, of a virgin projection screen, an endless, pristine white field waiting. Around you, the environment of the splicing room surrendered its geometry. The recursive, distorted metal frames and film tins dissolved, not into dust, but into pure light. The boundaries between where you were and what you were projecting vanished. You were floating in a void that had learned how to dream. The only anchor remaining was your own breath, and it was the first clean breath you had taken in eons. You looked at the unified chorus of the 9 heroes who had stood as your shield. They did not melt into the darkness of the old projected archive. They did not evaporate like the gray ghosts. As the light from the new virgin projection screen washed over them, their flickering, fused features began to crystallize, merging permanently with the structure of the light itself. They were becoming the very texture of this new reality. Vanio's courage became the vibrant copper-gold background. Iliasa's oceanic pressure became a deep, stabilizing blue that anchored the space. The precision of Antonin, the mechanic, transformed the unstable static into a functioning matrix of possibilities. Their collective stop-motion mask of identity softened, not disappearing, but fading into the gentle, constant pulse of the new light. They were no longer separate fates. They were the collective soul of this new universe, the shadow that allowed the light to have meaning. The sound of their conflicting voices was replaced by a singular, harmonic vibration, a hum that felt like the warmth of brass. The transition back was not a fall. It was a surrender to gravity. You felt your consciousness, which had been expanded across 1 billion variables, beginning to coalesce, to condense. You felt the weight of your own body return, the warmth of skin, the structure of bones, the familiar pull of matter. It was a sensation of deep, comforting exhaustion. Your hands, which had gripped the burning shears, relaxed. The shears themselves, once pulsing with the heartbeat of 10 stories, cooled to the temperature of your own physical palms, their internal gold-blue light fading into a faint, dormant glow. The brilliant starlight of the new screen began to retreat, pulling back like a tide, until the vast expanse of white light was replaced by the simple, heavy blackness of your own closed eyelids. You were descending back through the layers of the archive, back through the logic of time, until you reached the final threshold. You opened your eyes, the flash of white light was gone, the screaming voices were gone, the scent of rotten lavender and ozone was gone. You were back in your mundane world, perhaps sitting at your desk, or in your living room, or even just sitting on a simple park bench. The world was precisely as you had left it, yet it was fundamentally changed. The colors were more saturated, deeper, more saturated. The light that fell through a window didn't just illuminate a room. It had rhythm, a deliberate pacing that made the dust motes look like ancient stardust. The coincidences in the world around you were no longer coincidences. They were stitches in a broader, complex narrative fabric. You didn't believe in fluke anymore. You believed in structure. You felt a faint but definite sensation on your tongue. The deep taste of a spiced soup, the tang of marine salt, the smell of clean engine oil. It was the logic of the 9 stories, now anchored within you. You looked at your reflection in a nearby window or mirror. For a singular stop-motion second, you didn't see your own face. You saw the tired, relieved, and knowing smile of old Vincenc. And from that reflection, a faint whisper emerged, not as sound, but as an absolute certainty. "Thank you," the silence within you whispered. "The Rialto is closed, kata, but the script has only begun." You reached into your pocket and pulled out the heavy iron shears. They were cold, mundane, heavy iron, the internal light completely dormant. But you knew the truth. They were a tool of pure narrative creation, and they were yours. You knew that your role as a spectator was over. Reality was no longer something that simply happened to you. It was a blank screen waiting for your decisions, your cuts, your splices. You had seen the gray ghosts, You had integrated the monsters. You were the new Cutter. The story of the last reality Cutter has ended, but your story has just begun.